like to welcome you to our first Global Asia's Cyber Chat. The Cyber Chat is part of the Global Asia's initiative at Penn State University, and we're really excited to partner with Global Asia's for this event. Cyber Chats are meant to explore and spur thinking around how we go about the study of Asia and Asia's multiple diasporas around the world from multidisciplinary and translocal perspectives. In that vein, today's chat is organized around the theme of circulation, and specifically the circulation of Asian popular cultures. We're interested in how Asian popular cultures have responded to or engaged with other forms of national or regional popular cultures, how Asian American and Asian diaspora communities have drawn on Asian popular cultures, and the implications of homegrown Asian popular cultures circulating within and beyond Asia. Today, we'll hear from three amazing people exploring very different aspects of these questions. And I should also mention that today's chat, as I said at the beginning, is co-organized with the Center for Humanities and Arts. And thanks go especially to Liza Williams and Diamond Darling for helping with organization and technology. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Candace Epps Robertson of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, was unable to join us, but luckily we will be joined instead by Vernadette Gonzalez, who is professor and chair of American Studies at the University of Hawai, Mānoa. Professor Gonzalez works on tourism and militarism and many other things. Personally, I'll just add, her book, Securing Paradise from Duke University is amazing. And it's so exciting to have her here join us today. Professor Gonzalez works on tourism and militarism and many other things. Personally, I'll just add more from Vernadette in a little bit. Also joining us is Anita Mannur, professor of English and Asian American Studies at Miami University of Ohio. Mannur is author of many articles and books on a broad range of topics relating to South Asian diaspora and Asian American literature and culture. Her latest book is Intimate Eating, Racialized Spaces and Radical Futures, also from Duke University Press, and it's another fantastic book. The introduction is available on the Duke University Press for download, and I encourage everyone to have a look. Also joining us is Carla Jones, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Professor Jones works on the cultural politics of appearance with an empirical focus on the Indonesian middle class, questions of femininity, consumption, and religious propriety. She's the co-editor of the collection Re-Orienting Fashion, the Globalization of Asian Dress. And she's the author of many other articles. And also, I'll just add her curated collection, Pandemic Diaries, Affect and Crisis, on the American Ethnologist website, is really amazing, and you should check that out. So without further ado, let me welcome Professor Jones to start us off with some brief comments. Carla.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for coming. Special thanks to Liza Williams and the Center for Asian Studies and Penn and the Center for Humanities and the Arts. This is such a treat. I don't normally get to think about these ideas with colleagues beyond Indonesian studies typically, so this is a real treat. I'm going to just show a few slides to get us started with thinking about questions that are interesting to me and hopefully to everybody else, which have to do with the relationship between forms of transnational connection and exchange, but also beauty and religion. So this is a talk having to do with research I've been doing on a young woman named Ayana Jihye Moon. And this image captures a piece of her sort of quite prolific now social media image and represent sort of a reputation. Those of you who know Korean style may recognize that this post both shows Korean text, but also a location that's in Malaysia and clothing that does not look particularly Korean. That is, she's covered in a Malaysian style jilbab. And it's this combination of Korean aesthetics, that is Korean beauty standards, that focus on a certain kind of color palette and skin tone and skin glow, combined with her embodiment of Muslim piety, that have made her a very, very popular figure, not in Korea, but in Indonesia, the world's largest majority Muslim country. So let me just do a quick little spin, because I'm sure most everyone here is familiar with Indonesia, but as an American scholar of Indonesia, I'm always a little shocked by how little people know. So this is just a basic National Geographic map of Indonesia, the world's largest majority Muslim country in the world, but also the fourth largest country in the world, and sort of a ring of pearls right on the equator in Southeast Asia. It is also a place that has a phenomenally growing economy, growing middle class. And those of you who are paying attention to geopolitical news this week know that a lot of the world's leaders are in Bali for the G20. It is approaching a sort of economic profile in which it, by some measures, has a higher percentage of the population that qualifies as middle class than in the United States. And much of that is focused not just on a sort of urban concentration, but also a kind of active youth culture that is really, really sort of articulated and formed through consumption. These are images of Jakarta. Those of you who know Jakarta know that this is what it looks like, lots and lots of traffic, but that traffic itself is also considered an indicator of what feels like proof to Indonesians themselves that this is a growing economy. Modest fashion, which is a feature of the turn towards public forms of religious piety in the last 15 years or so, has now switched from being considered a kind of sign of backwardness or parochialism, and has now been harnessed by the Indonesian state as a major engine of the creative economy and an opportunity for Indonesia to hook up with the global garment industry, in which modest fashion itself globally is considered the fastest growing segment of all garment industries. As it turns out, all of us have to get dressed in the morning, and for those who are particularly seeking ways to style themselves as piously dressed, this is a sort of growing market segment. You can see that these are just a couple of examples from Indonesian marketing material, both Business Week and Ogilvy Noor, which is a advertising agency that focuses on the halal marketing industry or advertising industry. Modest fashion is also part of the sort of garment industry in Indonesia, and fashion in general is part of the creative economy in the sense that it's a majority of what is considered the creative economy, and modest fashion is a majority of the fashion industry. So those two things link in a way that's now considered a major engine for economic growth. What you see then in Indonesian rhetoric, particularly at the state level, but also among consumers and designers, is the idea that Indonesia has an opportunity to sort of go, quote unquote, go global. Towards a kind of global visibility through a particularly marked category, which is modest fashion. And yet I would argue that that is only part of what's going on in the consumption part of modest fashion in Indonesia, which isn't just about designers trying to grab global market share, but also about sort of the backside of that, which is that discovery of new religion, and even particularly the act of conversion, which many young Muslims in Indonesia who become more pious come to understand themselves, that is, they are converting to a religion in which they were already raised, is a kind of specific form of cosmopolitaneity and translation. Dian Pelangi is one of the most well-known Instagram influencers and designers in Indonesia, and she's been a beneficiary of the Indonesian national effort at the state level to have Indonesian modest fashion designers show in places beyond Indonesia. So for example, in New York, as well as in Indonesia. And some of these initiatives also focus on explicitly using Indonesian textiles or dress traditions like the sarong, which put front and center Indonesian textile traditions, not unlike this. Other designers, though, however, such as Anandia Putri, who is well known for her work as well as a modest fashion designer, entirely focuses her aesthetic around borrowing from Korean style. So you don't see any batik in this look. You don't see anything that looks Indonesian textile-y. The checked fabric here was British fabric. So she's not trying to translate Indonesian style for the world. She's trying to be a global designer who's modest. This is another example of her work, and most of her collections show in Korea, actually. This, however, is Ayana Jihemun, who is equally well known in Indonesia, but for the category, as she defines herself, as a Korean Muslim. And what you'll notice here is a hanbok, seated, what she's wearing, the traditional Korean garment, seated at a Buddhist temple with Korean script surrounding her, Korean ornamentation on her head, but most importantly, a hijab. So this hybrid combination look is not one she's borrowing from anybody. This is her look, but she has refined it into much more like what you've seen in the earlier image. And it's this combination that's made her a rock star in Korea. I mean, in Indonesia. In Indonesia, she is adored in part because she is, and what you'll see here, she's using English, and many of her posts, increasingly, she posts in English, Korean, and Indonesian, and Arabic. So she's intensely cultivating a sort of almost non-placeable identity. And in Indonesia, she's adored for her Indonesian precisely because it's not fluent. So it's this adorably accented, cute Korean style of Indonesian. And part of what's appealing about this, as you can probably imagine, is that this appears to reject what is a kind of expected narrative about the circulation of Korean popular culture, which is that the Korean Hallyu movement, the soft sort of diplomacy movement, has been extremely successful, that the Korean state's investment in exporting a version of culture that is both hyper-modern and yet indistinguishably, not specifically, obviously, traditionally Korean, has taken over the world. And that Indonesia is just another one of those places where that has happened. And to some extent, that's true. But Indonesians themselves are also resistant to that simple narrative. And so her active adaptation of a Korean identity, I mean, of an Indonesian identity as a convert, has made her extremely appealing within Indonesia. She gives interviews all the time on Indonesian talk shows. This is her at the opening of the primary brand of halal makeup, Wardah, at a new store in Jogja. And this post you'll see is a combination of English, Arabic, Indonesian, and most importantly, Javanese here. So this is a specific kind of emplacement in this because of the city where this store was opening. This image is one of the sort of key linking of her with the Indonesian beauty celebrity class of influencers, most of whom are also sponsored by Wardah. This young woman on the left of the frame is a former rap and hip hop artist named Dewi Sandra, and who has now become a very outspoken supporter of pious beauty and piety. And she is herself also adored in part because of her mixed identity. She was born in Brazil to a British father and Indonesian mother. And part of what you see in the sort of proliferation of specific category of appealing popular cultural pious figures is their capacity to move across sort of global spheres smoothly and frictionlessly as sort of almost unplaceable, but also deeply respectful towards Indonesia. So I will wrap up through just clicking through a few more quick images. This is the two of them having lunch. This is her, Ayana Moon, being hosted at the Korean embassy in Jakarta with the Korean ambassador to Indonesia as an ambassador to both Korean and Indonesian diplomacy and relations. And this is celebrating a Korean event, national event, but the script on the cake is in Indonesian. This is her on the Umroh, the sort of lesser Hajj, and her experience and her capacity and access to do that was through the religious and ministry affairs in Indonesia, not through the Korean state. This looks like a passport. She is not an Indonesian passport, but that is her vaccination booklet that was one of the steps towards being granted a visa to be able to go under the auspices of the Indonesian government. This is her on Umroh, and with more of her various celebrity sisters. This was also in Jakarta with Dewi Sandra and Halima Aden, a well-known global influencer. And then this is finally her featured in the Warde 25th anniversary video in 2020, in which she, again, pulls off the hanbok and hijab combination look, saying to the audience, hello there, world. Are you ready to be modern and to be, a consumer of pious fashion? This is set and shot in Korea in front of a Korean Buddhist temple. There's a lot to say about race here. I'm just going to post this to bring up as later about the whiteness of her skin. And then the very last thing I want to just point out is this is a sort of closing scene from one of the many interviews she does on Indonesian TV, in which she is wearing a well-known sort of nationalist streetwear brand called Damn, I Love Indonesia. And this is, ruang means room. This was her green room before the interview. So lots more to say, but I don't want to take up any more time. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Great. Thanks so much, Carla. Those are really fantastic. Lots of questions already, at least I do, but that's great. Let's move on to Professor Gonzalez, Vernadette. And you are, here we go.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, so mine won't nearly be as long or as detailed since this is a very last minute talk, but I want to talk to you about
and
this.
Thank you again for being here.
Oh, no worries. So it's a little bit more of a personal narrative, really, and there's a reason for that, partially because I think a lot of stories around BTS circle around the personal, right? That initial encounter with the group. So about a year ago, I found myself making a decision that I never thought I would make in my adult life. One that was more unexpected given that the pandemic was only just starting to wane, and this turned out to be the window between Delta and Omicron. And I had been hyper vigilant about my health. I found myself booking a flight to LA for myself and my eldest child, where we would attend both a live stream and a live stadium performance of BTS's Permission to Dance concert. At LA, I met up with one of my students who's the reason I was able to go. She had 2 extra tickets to the concert, which I bought, and with a friend of a friend, a dance scholar who was interested in BTS. So we were there for research, just so everybody were clear about this. That I'd only met once, but who is now one of my ride or dies. And we had plans to also find an old classmate from grad school who had recently come out of the BTS closet and published about being a middle-aged BTS fan on CNN News. So this is Ronnie Niotel, who is one of our now one of our co-editors for the book. So it had taken a few years and the dogged efforts of my oldest child, as well as increasing mentions by students. But by that point, especially with the pandemic and its toll, I had turned to BTS for escapism, pleasure, and community. Hallyu, as we know, the Korean wave with K-dramas, K-cinema, K-beauty, K-pop, had been cresting for a few years. I came late to it, but I became BTS curious during the pandemic, when many of us turned to music and art to soothe the stresses of social isolation, the fears of the unknown, and time and again, the anger at the inadequacies of our leaders' responses in the face of mass death, racially motivated violence, and other ways that the pandemic exacerbated deep existing social inequities to the point of life or death. So I took a deep dive not only into BTS's music, but especially dance. As a former dancer, I fell in love with Jimin and then J-Hope. I was fascinated by their Cinderella story, which in some ways has made them stand out from their peers who emerged out of the idol system and the established then big three management corporations for idols. And I was endeared by the content, and there's a lot of content they produced through their self-made variety and travel shows, which extended the fantasy of intimacy, comfort, goofiness, like they were in the same room with you, to their vast and growing global audience, ARMY. So what BTS animated for me during this crucial time was a sense of community among far-flung people in my life. There's the kinetic energy, but also inexplicable closeness one can experience as ARMY, especially in a concert, through the shared love of a common object, the obsessive shared love of a common object, I should add, but also the unexpected pleasures of connecting, especially through something most academics and perhaps many other serious adults might consider superficial or silly. I discovered that there were Facebook groups for fans over 40. So I joined one. I am Lurker. ARMY who are grandparents, ARMY who are parents, right? So there's a really kind of interesting community that is that was to me unexpectedly diverse. And it also then became a mode for connecting with other academics. Following the concert, some of us academics connected. Some of us started out as fans, like myself, who as academics study things other than BTS or Korean popular culture. And some of us are academics of Korean popular culture who are also BTS fans. So we had a group chat, and in that group chat, we would share, this was a very unacademic group chat, I should just point out. We would share links, photos, different images, memes, just generally it captured our excitement about BTS content, but it also became a mode for us to communicate support for each other during a particularly hard time. But because we are nerds at heart, the conversation around BTS half jokingly turned to how we could turn our BTS obsession into research so we could get paid to fangirl. And then the questions became more serious. How does this global phenomenon, as an increasingly common object of conversation among our students, how could we all approach it differently based on our disciplinary training? What could we get out of it differently that would be interesting to people? So about a year ago, we decided to pitch a book about BTS to Duke University Press as a way to explore the historical, the social, and cultural emergence of this musical group and the world they have generated around them. We were particularly interested in questions around the fandom, around technologies and platforms that had proliferated BTS to the world and the world back to BTS. We were interested in how BTS operated as a cultural, political, social force in the different sites and communities that took up BTS as a sort of rallying point of identity. So we wanted, in short, to engage what BTS means for different people and to diversify the approach that had mostly defined discussions of BTS, which had been coming out of Korean media and industry studies and fandom studies. And we wanted to open up discussions of how engagements with BTS, their music, their content, their ideas could be animated through other approaches, and to kind of move it away from sort of a sense of who could be an expert or who could study something like BTS. So some of the questions we had that are driving this particular cyber chat, because I was asked to look at the questions that y'all had talked about earlier, do sort of are reflected in the kinds of ways in which we are seeing the contributors engage with BTS. So around the question of the circulation of Asian culture around the globe, for instance, so one of our contributors does a deep dive into South Korea's state support of culture and tourism to examine the structural conditions that help give rise to a phenomenon like BTS, which then becomes a vehicle for the further circulation of Asian cultural forms globally. Others touch on the legacies of empire in Asia and the diaspora. So you can probably guess that this is where my own short contribution comes in, but I'll talk about other people's. So another one of our contributors looks at the material roots of the BTS light stick, the ARMY bomb, and the fandom, the name is ARMY, And the recent news of enlistment, right, or non-enlistment that has sort of dominated debates in South Korea around BTS, and ties it to the military relationship that continues to shape US-South Korea dynamics, which doesn't often enter into popular cultural debates or discussion around enlistment. Another contributor talks about how BTS's entry into the hashtag Stop Asian Hate conversation with their visit to the White House and their very, very popular 2021 tweet right after the Atlanta killings contributed to an understanding of racism that makes it an individual kind of affliction and a solution to this problem that reinforced carceral logics rather than a broader understanding of racism as a driver and effect of US empire and labor exploitation, both in the United States and globally. Still others look at power in Asia and the diaspora and how these play out in different modes and scales. There's a couple pieces that really have fascinated me over the course of the editing. One was written by a group who were organizing during the Duterte Leni Robredo elections in the Philippines just this past year. The Leni Robredo contingent in particular basically leveraged the message, the social media images, and the fandom model of BTS and K-pop in general, and translated it to fight against social media misinformation. So it was really interesting how they would use these memes and try to reach the youth vote. And as we know from the results of the Duterte, the 2022 elections, Bongbong Marcos won, so the forces of misinformation won, and a lot of who voted for him were the youth of the Philippines, right? So it was a really kind of crucial theater of struggle. Another contributor talks about the social media communities that organize around identity, and this kind of touches on what Carla was talking a little bit about earlier. There's a huge Muslim army in terms of the fandom of BTS. And online, they create spaces of connection, affirmation, as well as pushback in the form of educating non-Muslims through the BTS connection, the BTS fandom, about the Muslim world, and in some instances even promote support of progressive and radical political causes. So it becomes a really interesting space to explore. So the sheer diversity of the contributions we pulled together has been surprising even to us as editors, and it shows how popular culture is taken up to think about the world in complex ways that give insights into forms of power and sociality and political imagination. So the reader is now being assembled, and I'll put this here because we have an open call right now for BTS fan art. This is one of the pieces that is probably going to be making it in. And so the reader is now being assembled a mere year after we had the call out. And we hope to submit it in the next month to the press. So please do circulate this call for art. If you know anybody, criticalbtsreader.com has the full information. And we are basically, in the editorial decision, in keeping with what brought us together and the most critical of BTS messaging. So just so you know what's happening with this reader, all of the royalties will support a queer advocacy group in Seoul, which is especially critical with the election of a further right presidency and the sort of erosion of support for queer youth in Korea. So we wanted to make sure that this was a project that was in keeping with the sort of not explicit messaging of BTS, but certainly in the spirit of BTS. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vernadette. That's great. Judging from the comments that were coming in, there's some Army here with us today. So that was really interesting, and I'm also really intrigued by the by the connections that we've seen so far in terms of social media in particular, between both you and Carla's talks. So it'd be fun to explore that a little bit if we have some time. But let's turn to Professor Mannur. Anita, over to you.
I'm really excited to be here and be in conversation with both Carla and Vernadette. So speaking about escapism, I'm kind of talking about something that's become my escapism that I ended up writing about. So in my time today, I want to talk a little bit about food and popular culture, and to steal a line from Levi-Strauss, show how food is good to think with. Sort of germane to the topic at hand for today, my own research is about how food and discourses about food circulate transnationally. And a big part of my recent book, Intimate Eating, considers that food can be used to impact social justice movements and to create more just and inclusive publics for QT BIPOC people and communities. But since this is a lunchtime talk and everyone is late in their semester, and more importantly, this week is the finale. Actually, today is the finale of a rather beloved cooking show. I decided I would trick you by introducing some levity into my comments, and in order to think about some heavier issues about how the legacy of empire and imperialism continues to circulate in Asian diasporas and among viewing publics of cooking shows. Yes, I am talking about the Great British Bake Off. The finale airs in, I think it's just about 2 hours to be exact, in Britain, but we will have to wait until Friday to see it. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about food and popular culture. Damn, I had placed all of this so perfectly to the left of my screen, but apparently I didn't quite do it well. So I was reading a review of my book recently, as one does, and in a blog entry about his very lovely review of my book, Fabio Parascoli notes that my book invites us to reassess pieces of popular culture that we may be familiar with, but whose power we may not be fully aware of. So this is kind of what I want to do in my comments today. And so I've just thrown up this quote, and I'm not going to read it, but when I read, Fabio's words, I'm reminded of the Great British Bake Off. I refer to it as the Bake Off because it's an affectation rather than calling it what the Americans do, which is the Great British Baking Show. And why, for me, at least, it offers a lot by way of nuancing the idea that food is good to think with. So I can't see the chats, but I am curious whether a lot of people do watch this show. Typically 10 to 12 home cooks from across Britain gather under the tent, right? The white tent, to bake all manner of sweets and savories. And so on this show, I would say that the nation, Britain, becomes this intimate space where baking forms the basis of a shared vision for the future, and one that runs very contrary to the ideas of the sort of separationist UK idea in post-Brexit era. And so while the home bakers are important to this vision of a nation, particularly, I mean, if we think about, there will be some spoilers of today's season, unfortunately, not who the winner is, but because I don't know that, obviously. But, is thinking about not just how people come together on the show from different ethnicities, but the baking ingredients that themselves and how that establishes the ethos of the nation's imaginary. And so in the sort of construction of this multicultural post-colonial utopia that's sort of far away from the exclusionary post-Brexit UK, race plays an important part in defining what can be baked into sort of very traditional British bakes. And since about 2000, right, since the show started airing, it has imagined itself to be a very different kind of baking show, right? It imagines a space of possibility for rivals to compete against one another, but also to root for one another. So sort of the ideas like out there beyond like what's under the marquee tent, Britain may be moving towards the kind of exclusionary politics, but that sort of severs the link that the nation has with difference, and even get rid of the kind of like Black British contestants that are so beloved on the show. But inside the tent, there is a sort of kinder and newer nation, right? We're in sort of an intimate eating public in which the members of the nation bake together to imagine a better future for a nation riven by exclusion and division. And I think it's notable that the contestants themselves are attuned to the possibilities that the show traffics in, and sort of particularly in terms of providing a salve against the realities of a nation that's increasingly hostile to otherness. And I was fascinated to read, this is a quotation from Chetna Makan, who was in season 5, for how she's cognizant of this logic. Again, I'm not going to read her whole thing. But as a South Asian immigrant contestant, she was one of the first on the show to try and bring Indian flavors into her bakes. And she really kind of lauds, this is a New York Times article, and she talks about sort of the show's embrace of multiculturalism, and that it provides the space to suffuse sort of very staid British classics with sort of the flavors and tastes of an immigrant palate, right? And she, I think, very succinctly kind of articulates how the Bake Off has been successful in its ability to reimagine the nation. And, you know, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that the space in the Bake Off is imagined as this post-colonial utopia, but it's also set in this idealized version of England, right? Like they all work together in this bucolic landscape under this very pleasant white marquee tent with Union Jack bunting. And then, you know, the camera will sort of pan from close-ups of a bake to like an English flower or English rain, you know, and it's sort of, or a bird in a tree, right? So some singular aspect of the pastoral English landscape. And, you know, I mean, and some people have even said like the show tries to produce its own version of royalty, right? So like from the Mary Berry era, she's kind of like almost like a signifier of the monarchy, you know, and, you know, is, you know, was at least almost as old as the Queen and stuff like that. So, I mean, this is sort of a version of Englishness, right, that the multicultural nation rallies around. And in contrast to this is the sort of increasing kind of the pressures of xenophobia, right? And the very real sort of structural racism that reminds us that, you know, that in some ways this vision of a sort of multicultural utopia is ultimately that, a utopic one. And so, you know, while this vision of difference is sort of baked into the confection, the show, I'm speaking specifically about Indian spices. I'm not going to actually do a lot of detail about it, but the show sort of celebrates the differences that, say, Indian spices or Indian-inspired designs can sort of bring to the traditional British bake. But this is often, I would argue, a sort of very surface level difference. I'm just going to kind of scroll through some images of things that I was thinking about. So, you know, you have like, you know, the cardamom pistachio coffee Swiss roll, and then these are the images, right, that are always drawn, what they're going to look like versus what they end up looking like. But what's interesting is that although they're sort of seemingly inclusive of the possibilities that Indian inspired, and I would certainly extend that to Asian inspired desserts can find at, you know, the proverbial gingham altar, there's very little effort to contextualize the provenance of many of these ingredients or dishes, and very little attention is paid to the colonial intimacies that make it possible to imagine Asian desserts within this particular conjuring of Britishness. You know, I would say think Stuart Hall, right? I'm not going to quote that, but there's that famous quote about how English is a cup of tea. Well, the tea comes from India and the sugar comes from the Caribbean. So this potent symbol of Britishness is nothing but like built on the labor of brown and black people, right? And so one thing I want to talk about very quickly is the sort of pop cultural sort of critical responses to this, and sort of this logic of enfolding colonial intimacies into the vision of the nation is what we see in a parodic piece that was published called The Great Brexit Bake Off. And in this piece, I'm going to just, again, scroll through it and let you read through them. Basically, the author, Kritika Vargur, lampoons the show's characteristic challenges by imagining a sort of series of alternative making challenges that speak to sort of the sort of vagaries of contemporary post-Brexit ethnic and racial climate. So there's like a mock-up of 4 different episodes with the signature, the technical, and the showstopper. And so this is episode 1, which is on breads, right? Bake any flatbed bread that originated in a country that was once part of the British Empire. You can kind of read on, and then just a couple more. Yeah, so, you know, your favorite savory hand pie that can be served to members of a potential all British zero, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last one, cake. You know, I like the last one in particular, design your best frosted anniversary cake for Princess Harry and the Duchess of Sussex, the last vestiges of British soft power in the world. And so I think what, you know, it's sort of, you know, sort of like what this piece reminds us is how the sort of show traffics in sort of this palatable version of reality, but it really hones in on the fact that the provenance of food is never neutral, and that baking has a history that's rooted in imperialism, and And while, not simply a wholly, inclusive nation, it's still like, something that's worth thinking about. So in some ways, just to kind of wrap up, because I know we are getting close to time and I don't want to take up any more. I'm just going to cut some stuff short. I would say that the bake-off really relies on viewers and contestants' abilities to kind of access a kind of cruel optimism that Lauren Berlant has described, so I won't, because I think, what could be more compelling than the idea that if we bake together in a space that is not quite the past, but looks very much like what we want the future to look like, we can all sort of collectively build a better, good life, right? So intimacy in this context becomes defined by its structural investment in this possibility of a kind of cruel optimism that recognizes the false promises of baking together, leading to better community, while also providing a kind of temporary salve from all the forms of inequality, despair, and lack of hope that kind of make it necessary for these forms of optimism to emerge. I'll end this here because this has been quite long, I think, but a longer version of this is in my book. This is just some silly screen grabs. That's the cover of my book. I put in a link, which is stupid because you can't click on it. That's the first page of my chapter on the, I'm really good at self promoting, not really. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Anita. That was really fun. And I wish I had had lunch before the cyber chat because I got really hungry. I'll just put something out there for people to reflect on whether they want to or not. But I'm struck by all three of you, and I was engrossed by all three of your comments. You could have gone on and on with all of those. Much longer, and unfortunately, we just don't have as much time as we would like to have. But I was really fascinated by all of your presentations and comments, and I was struck by a couple commonalities across some of them in different ways. And one was just kind of the agency of consumption, I guess. A lot of what we kind of think about in terms of circulation of popular culture, we're thinking about cultural production and how it kind of goes and maybe impacts other communities and those kinds of things. And a lot of what we've heard from you is the role what happens when people consume culture and how powerful that can be in terms of opening up all sorts of new ideas, new politics, new issues, and I thought that was really interesting, in particular in the context of social media as a vehicle by which that happens, or other forms of media, but in particular, Vernadette's and Carla's really focused on the role social media plays, and I guess fandom as a way of thinking about consumption in much broader terms, in much more complicated terms. Thinking about what we learn from fans. I think Vernadette, you mentioned that who is the expert here, and when and really changing the kind of analytical game around to kind of thinking about what do we learn from fans in their agency, in the ways they work with these things, and how social media has made that so much more vibrant and active space of politics and things like that. So that's not really I haven't really articulated a question, but I'm just struck by those kinds of commonalities across all of you. And so I would invite any reflection that you have further on how social media has really changed the way we think about, or way we should be thinking about, circulation of popular culture in completely different ways that maybe we're not really quite yet prepared for, with the kind of analytical approaches that we've been trained with and grown up with. So I'll leave that out there as a comment, inviting your reflection, and invite people to also add questions in the chat.
I can say something really quickly.
Sure.
I was thinking that, it's really interesting to think about how we were all in some way or form talking a little bit about this issue of fandom, right? And sort of repurposing meaning. Because I was thinking of like satire is like maybe the old school version of like fanfic, right? In some ways, and then repurposing it and sort of providing a kind of critical perspective. But I was thinking about how important it is to kind of, but also like social media and TikTok and all of these spaces and Instagram are where culture, like it gets reinvented, and I feel sort of wholly unequipped to sort of talk about this. I feel like probably people in the audience know much more because I don't really consume that stuff as much as I sometimes wish I did. But there's like really interesting ways that these texts are, I mean, we always say this about pop culture, right? It's always evolving and the meanings are changing, and it's so interesting to think about the sort of giant global reach of it. I mean, and it's thinking even like a show like The Bake Off, right? It will air tonight and there will be so many people who will be so frustrated by spoilers, right? That it becomes very tricky for thinking about how we sort of have this fantasy that we're all watching these things together, but like we kind of have to rethink all of that stuff, right? We share popular culture, but not always in the same temporality, right? Benedict Anderson doesn't work anymore in the same ways, right? But he does. Anyway, sorry, this isn't just a form.
No, super interesting. Yeah.
Laura, are you going to really ask me to talk about Mexican Week?
So Laura says, Anita, I would love to hear your thoughts on episodes of the Great British Bake Off themed specifically around difference, like the Japanese episode or the recent Mexican Week. Why those nations' cuisines in particular?
I'm as interested. I mean, I was a little bit behind on this season because I was trying to catch up on stuff, and so I missed a lot of the conversation on social media about Mexican Week, and I just watched it I think last week, and I was like, tacos aren't a baked food. I know that there are tortillas, but it's not a tortilla challenge. I mean, I don't know. I think where it sort of became, why those two nations, I mean, Japanese food, I think, has a certain kind of cultural capital, and Mexican, I'm guessing they're trying to like access a more US audience maybe, but it just seemed that they kind of, the reason that I'm going to answer a different question, which is the one I want to answer, I think, but that I think part of the what was interesting to me was how much fans sort of turned against them because they turned to this kind of like easy kind of racism and they thought it was cute. And like in the context of US viewers, that wasn't cute. Like anti-Mexican sentiment is not something cute, right? It's very real. And so it sort of felt very, I'm trying to think of, it's a bit ableist, tone deaf, right? Like it wasn't listening to what is the critical context of who's watching this. And that it just sort of seemed to, yeah, I don't want to, there's only like 9 minutes, but I'm curious what other people think about it as well, but I think that it feels this season a little bit like it jumped the shark in some ways. There was this old show called never mind, like it's lost some of its edge, right? And what it liked about it. And I think part of the reason it also sits uneasily is that the show really was celebrated for kind of being inclusive, etc. But, and what it really did was to sort of use humor at the expense of Mexican people. And I don't remember the Japanese week I don't think it was this season. I think it was previous. They always had International Week, but it seems like they have one episode that's on something different. And then that's it. And then, I don't know. Sorry, I'll stop there.
So you're going to have to continue because we have Lynn Kalanauskas also asks us a question kind of related to this, right? About a counter way of thinking about what's going on instead of an idealized post-Brexit image. You could see the show as continued othering of foreign cultures or tastes, as the hosts are always worried about new or exotic tastes that that people may not be used to, that may clash with classic British bakes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that I think that the show itself, I mean, is sort of, I think that the way that they try to present the interaction among the contestants is that, but of course, I mean, one of the things that got me interested in the show was how, Paul Hollywood will look at me and be like, and look at some ingredient and be like, pandan, what is this? Like, as like, oh, I don't know, like millions of people eat it. And like, just, and so there was a way that it sort of would reinforce sort of the foreignness and being like somehow baking is a language, right? And it's a language of intimacy in multiple forms. And so it's also a way to sort of show that you understand what is, I mean, this is sort of hearkening back to some of my older work, but thinking about fusion is never fusion. It's always about a certain kind of fusion, right? And so what fits acceptably. If something is too different, it can't be brought into a bake. But then you sort of think, well, why can't the whole terms of this be different, right? Why does it have to be that there's always something that's being assimilated to be made familiar? Like, and so that's where I think, going back to Mexican Week question, right? Like, why not just actually sort of say, like, if you're going to do a week that's about difference, like fully embrace that. I mean, I know they did the pan dulce, but like actually look at the kind of fascinating stuff that's coming out of Latin American or Mexican, baking traditions, right? Yeah. So
And so let's turn to Jennifer's question to Carla about whether or not is there a male version of modest fashion, and I think that circles back to Jennifer's original question about gender more broadly. So let's continue that direction.
I love that question. Thank you, Jennifer. The answer is yes, and it's very threatening. So this broad sort of context in which Indonesian modestly styled women who are now a sort of face of friendly Islam in a kind of particular national conversation, but also strategic diplomatic effort, is in conversation with other stuff that I didn't reference, which is, Indonesia is situated in this geographically, historically long-standing crossroads sort of spot. And the proliferation of new forms of public piety in the last couple of decades have been partly, anxiety making for a lot of Indonesians, but also the sort of political science class that are following that as evidence of not an organic or locally developing movement, but rather the result of meddling from outside, specifically from the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And so there's a whole debate about Indonesia losing its Indonesianness through secret global influence, or a sort of cosmopolitaneity that's oriented towards not just Saudi, but Arab versions of Islam. And when the hijab originally started becoming popular a couple of decades ago in Indonesia, it was heavily critiqued as inauthentic, not local, and that Indonesian women were just becoming Saudi. And now, as you can sense, that's not what the practice of this new clothing movement looks like now in Indonesia. And it's been actually repurposed now as a kind of global marketing strategy of Indonesia as the place with the nice Muslims. But male Muslims who choose to signal their piety still carry that connotation of being hyper Saudi and appearing to have been influenced by Gulf aesthetics. So that's part of what's so interesting around the addition of Korea as a different sort of node of aesthetic influence. It sort of decenters, or at least helps us understand that the conversation within Indonesia isn't just about the Gulf. It's a much more complex conversation. And part of what's so satisfying about Ayana Jihemun is that it's not that simply that Indonesians are absorbing lots of different forms of popular culture far beyond the Gulf, but also non-Indonesians are absorbing and interested in Indonesianness. And that's very sort of reaffirming in a sort of narrative of where is Indonesia in these kinds of conversations. I'll be honest, Indonesians constantly ask me, why isn't Indonesia featured in, baking shows or whatever? Why isn't our cuisine part of these stories? Why is it always Thai food that stands in for Southeast Asian food? So the idea that somehow Indonesian aesthetics and lifeways are making it onto the stage of a country that is considered modern and developed like Korea is just really reaffirming and exciting and thrilling. That's a long answer, but the way to put that broader context.
That's a great answer, and there's so much more to be said. And so let's go to Xiaoling Chen's question, since Jennifer's ceded her point in line, place in line to Xiaoling. And so Xiaoling, do you want to ask your question directly, or should I, if not, I can just read it.
Thank you so much, Tin, and thank you for the three speakers. These are excellent talks, and I really enjoy it. And I didn't expect that when I come in, for sure, because I'm not a pop culture person. But then I really love how you think through those different topics, and so I'm very interested in knowing like how you because I'm also like 30 years and I've become interested in pop culture from last year, and it's a very interesting process to think through why I become interested in this, and why do I need this as an academic? Writing my own dissertation right now, actually with team, and I would really love to write something in pop culture as well in the future after I finish my dissertation. So a question for Dr. Gonzalez. Sorry if I butcher your name. And so I'm really interested in how you think through your identity, you know, as a pop cultural fan in academics, and also like how these identities kind of mediate your writing. I know that's like, I can think of that as like a very intimate process when you go through a lot of things in being a pop culture fan, but then also how I also like the idea of you really zoom out of that identity and think through like broader context. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I think this came a lot out of, I mean, you know, I think we're all interested in the things we're interested in and find pleasure in the things we find pleasure in, and that you can bracket that and make that a separate thing from what you study, or you can kind of go, oh, there's something interesting here, right? And for me, I think the question of looking to popular culture has always been there, but I think more recently, in terms of like my identity as an academic, it's been about how do we get the things we think about and the things we're trained in out to a broader audience, right? Because otherwise we're just talking to each other, and we're, you know, and our students are clearly hungry and wanting to have conversations about these kinds of issues. And if it's a popular cultural object that gets them hooked, and it's a thing that gets them, you know, a common text that they're reading, because they're not reading the things we're assigning them to read. They're viewing the TikToks, they're looking at the Instagram feeds, they're looking at Great British Baking Show, they're watching the concerts, right? So these are the kinds of texts that are the common texts that we have to kind of grapple with. And I think in that sense, there's agency in the consumer, because we have to then kind of speak the language and translate the kinds of things that we think are important and they are already thinking about, right, in so many ways. Because I enter into, like, I don't do Facebook anymore, but I will lurk. And they're having these conversations in these Facebook groups around race, around militarism. Yeah, maybe they're not as sophisticated as what might be happening in a classroom that you're running, but certainly they are having them, and they are having debates around them, right? And so that is super fascinating to me. And so how can you, and this is going to sound like totally weird, infiltrate or like be part of that space in a way that actually engages and brings what you bring as an academic into that world, right? And so in that sense, you know, I think that there's so much power in that space. There's so much potential for change, as you know, we were seeing as editors of this BTS reader. We thought, oh, there's so many ways in which the fans are already going above and beyond what BTS themselves is messaging, because BTS is really, really constrained by the pop cultural idol industry and South Korean politics, and what you cannot say in public, and what you can gesture to and not gesture to. But the fans themselves are way beyond that, right? In terms of the kinds of things that they do actually support and gather around. So it's been really interesting to kind of see that, and the fact that the fans, you know, there's some tension around this, that the fandom is majority women. That's one way to kind of devalue or like look down on this group, but it's also a potentially powerful group, right? When you think about the ways in which Roe v. Wade has backfired, the decision around Roe v. Wade has backfired in terms of politics. There is a really powerful potential there that I think that as academics, we need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, that's great. I really like the fact that, Xiaoling, your question brought up issues of pedagogy, and those have been very much part of implied parts of the conversation. But I also think it's a part of the Global Asia's project more broadly, and so it's great to have us engage on that issue as well. But I think in the interest of time, we're going to have to bring this to a close. Again, so much. I want to thank our three speakers for just really fantastic, engaging presentations and really getting us thinking on a lot of things. There was a lot of thinking going on and a lot of really interesting conversation in just an hour. And so that was great to see. So thank you again. Thanks, Liza and Diamond, for helping us organize. And thanks, Jennifer, for all the help with Center for Humanities and Arts.